longer caution. It is self-protection disguised as intelligence. As long as the plan remains inside your mind, you can imagine that it is flawless. As long as your talent remains untested, you can continue believing that you are exceptional. But the moment you act, the illusion enters the battlefield. This is the paradox of false superiority. The person with the greatest ability can become the person who produces the least. Meanwhile, people with less talent step outside, absorb the first wounds, learn to adapt, and slowly occupy the territory that the gifted person only imagined possessing. Reality does not reward unused ability. It responds only to action that has been carried into the world. Gifted people often grow accustomed to understanding things quickly, learning with less effort, and surpassing others while using only half their strength. That ease becomes a sweet poison. It teaches them that their value lies in not having to struggle. Then they encounter a challenge that demands real endurance, and suddenly their identity feels threatened. They begin avoiding battlefields that might expose their limits, choosing games they can win quickly, abandoning projects when progress stops coming easily. On the surface, they speak of high standards, proper timing, and careful judgment. But beneath those respectable words lives the fear of being proven merely human. Remember this: potential is a form of imaginary power. It allows you to feel larger than your actual results. As long as you do not act, the legend remains intact. But that safety gradually becomes a prison. With each passing year, the distance between the image inside your mind and the evidence outside grows wider, and to protect the old image, you must invent more explanations. Eventually, you are no longer fighting to succeed. You are fighting to avoid discovering the truth about yourself. That is the moment talent becomes a curse. Never admire your potential for too long. A sword hanging on a palace wall may shine more beautifully than a sword carried through battle, but it has proven nothing. Ability acquires value only when it survives friction, failure, exposure, and judgment. The less gifted person who acts accumulates power day after day, while the talented person who protects an image loses power day after day. Eventually, they look around and discover that the people they once considered inferior have passed them, claimed positions, built reputations, and gained influence that they once assumed would naturally belong to them. Then they call the world unfair, but the world never promised to reward what you might have become. It rewards what you were willing to turn into reality. If you want to escape this curse, stop asking how great you could become. Ask what you have placed into the real world today. The most dangerous person is not the one who lacks talent. It is the one who becomes addicted to the feeling of being talented, while never allowing that talent to enter the fire and discover what it is truly worth. The fire does more than test talent. It destroys the fantasy that talent is limitless. And this is where the second law begins. Potential is seductive because it has no edges. Before you act, almost anything remains possible. You can imagine the book becoming important, the business becoming powerful, the idea changing your life, the talent finally receiving the recognition it deserves. Nothing has yet contradicted you. Nothing has yet placed a number beside your worth. In that private kingdom, you are still undefeated. This is why potential can become more intoxicating than achievement. Achievement is concrete, and anything concrete has limits. A finished book can be criticized, a business can fail, a performance can expose weakness, a decision can reveal poor judgment, but potential remains untouched because it exists beyond evidence. It is the last territory where the ego can rule without opposition. Watch what the mind does when this territory is threatened. It begins to produce delays that seem reasonable. One more course, one more plan, one more revision, one more season of preparation. The language sounds responsible, but the hidden purpose is often preservation. As long as the work is unfinished, the fantasy remains alive. You are not a failed writer. You are a writer who has not published yet. You are not an unsuccessful entrepreneur. You are still developing the right concept. You are not afraid. You are simply waiting for better conditions. This is how the ego converts uncertainty into shelter. The ancient rulers understood a similar temptation. A prince who had never led an army could imagine himself a great commander. The court could flatter his instincts, praise his intelligence, and predict victories that had never been earned. The battlefield was dangerous not only because he might lose men, but because it would end the fantasy. One afternoon of chaos could reveal what years of praise had concealed. Your private ambitions operate by the same law. The longer they remain untested, the more magnificent they can become. The danger is subtle. You may begin to prefer the image of becoming something to the discipline required to become it. At first, this feels like hope. Later, it becomes dependency. You revisit the future in your mind because the future still obeys you. Reality does not. Reality resists, delays, humiliates, and forces revision. It makes you choose one path and abandon 10 others. This is the true price of action. To act is to murder alternate versions of yourself. The moment you choose one profession, one project, one relationship, one direction, countless imagined lives begin to die. Many talented people cannot tolerate this narrowing. They mistake possibility for freedom, when in fact endless possibility can become paralysis. A door that never closes also never leads anywhere. The mature mind learns to accept limitation because limitation is the condition of creation. A sculptor does not mourn every shape the stone cannot become. He removes what is unnecessary until one form emerges. Your life demands the same cruelty. Choose, cut away, expose yourself, and allow reality to answer. Do not worship the untouched version of your talent. It has not suffered enough to deserve your loyalty. The great seduction of potential is that it lets you feel powerful without risking power. It offers identity without evidence, status without sacrifice, and hope without consequence. But time quietly changes the terms. At 25, unrealized potential may look promising. At 45, it begins to look suspicious. At 65, it can become a private accusation. The world has seen this pattern many times. A person once described as brilliant becomes known mainly for what never happened. The tragedy is not that the talent disappeared. The tragedy is that the person protected it so carefully that it was never allowed to become real. Remember this. An infinite future is useful only when it is sacrificed to a finite act. The moment you accept that every real choice excludes other possibilities, you stop treating limitation as humiliation. You begin to see it as power. A blade cuts because it has an edge. A river moves because it has banks. A life gains force when possibility is narrowed into commitment. And once commitment begins, another distinction appears, one that separates those who merely possess talent from those who are driven to use it every day. Once possibility has been narrowed into commitment, the real test begins, because choosing a path once is easy. Choosing it again tomorrow is where most gifted people begin to disappear. This is the difference between strategy and compulsion. The merely talented person waits for the right mood, the right conditions, the right surge of confidence. The person who eventually achieves mastery does something far less glamorous. He returns to the work, whether he feels powerful or ordinary. Talent may open the gate, but repetition decides who remains inside the kingdom. This is difficult for gifted people to accept because early ability creates a dangerous memory. They remember how quickly things once came to them, how easily they impressed teachers, colleagues, friends, or competitors. They begin to associate excellence with ease. Then life presents a field where ease is no longer enough. Progress slows, praise disappears, and the work becomes repetitive. At that moment, the gifted person faces a choice that feels almost insulting: continue like an apprentice, or retreat and preserve the old identity of being naturally exceptional. Many retreat. They call it changing direction, reassessing priorities, protecting their energy, or waiting for a better opportunity. Sometimes those explanations are true. Often they are simply elegant names for resistance. The person ruled by compulsion behaves differently. He does not need to negotiate with himself each morning. The work has moved beneath preference. It has become part of identity, almost like breathing. History repeatedly shows this pattern in artists, commanders, craftsmen, scientists, and builders. Their advantage was not always greater intelligence. Their advantage was that they returned. They returned after humiliation, after boredom, after bad results, after applause had faded. They learned something that the gifted amateur refuses to learn. Consistency is not a personality trait. It is a form of power. Every day you execute, you reduce the distance between intention and reality. Every day you avoid, the distance grows, and eventually the gap becomes so large that even beginning feels unbearable. Do not mistake strategic thinking for strategic living. A person can understand every principle of discipline and still remain undisciplined. He can explain motivation, analyser risque, predict failure, and speak brilliantly about long-term goals while producing almost nothing. Knowledge becomes dangerous when it gives you the sensation of movement without movement itself. The mind feels active. Therefore, the ego assumes progress is occurring. But the world does not measure internal activity. It measures what survives contact with time, friction, and consequence. This is why daily execution is so brutal. It removes the privilege of self-deception. The page either exists or it does not. The call was made or it was not. The body was trained or it was not. The difficult conversation happened or it did not. Reality is primitive in this way. And that simplicity terrifies sophisticated minds. They prefer complexity because complexity leaves room for excuses. Compulsion closes those exits. It says, this is what I do. Therefore, I do it. At first, This may feel mechanical. That is precisely the point. You are building a structure strong enough to carry you when emotion becomes unreliable. The ancient armies that conquered vast territories did not depend on inspiration before every march. They depended on formation, ritual, repetition, and obedience to process. Your ambitions require the same severity. Never ask whether you feel ready when readiness has become another disguise for hesitation. Ask whether the action belongs to the path you chose. If it does, perform it, then return tomorrow. This is how raw talent becomes force, not through one heroic burst, but through thousands of ordinary acts that the ego finds beneath its dignity. The gifted person often wants a grand test worthy of his abilities. Mastery offers something more humiliating. Small repetitions, invisible improvements, corrections. Nobody applauds, yet this is where the transformation occurs. The person who submits to repetition slowly becomes less dependent on talent itself. Skill hardens, judgment deepens, instinct becomes more accurate, and identity shifts from someone who could do great work to someone who does the work. That shift is decisive, but it creates another danger, because the more identity becomes tied to ability, the more painful criticism can become. Beneath the disciplined surface, the gifted person may still carry a fragile core, and that hidden weakness is where the next form of self-sabotage begins. Discipline can make a gifted person formidable, but it does not automatically make him psychologically strong. In fact, the more identity is built around being exceptional, the more dangerous criticism becomes. This is the brittle core of the gifted. From the outside, such people often appear confident, decisive, even superior. They have been praised for intelligence, speed, destin, memory, judgment, or creative instinct. Over time, these qualities stop being abilities and become a private title. They are no longer things the person does well. They become proof of who the person believes he is. That is where the weakness begins. When an ordinary person fails at a task, he may conclude that he needs more practice. When a gifted person fails at a task tied to his identity, he may experience something closer to exposure. The failure does not merely say that the work was poor. It whispers that perhaps the entire legend was exaggerated. This is why some highly capable people become strangely defensive in areas where they should be strongest. They argue with feedback, dismiss critics as ignorant, abandon projects after one public setback, or shift attention toward fields where admiration comes more easily. They are not protecting the work. They are protecting the self that the work was supposed to prove. The deeper the identification, the more fragile the structure. Think of an ancient palace built with magnificent marble but resting on a cracked foundation. Visitors admire the columns and gold, while the ruler listens at night for the sound of stone beginning to split. The gifted person often lives with the same concealed anxiety. Praise soothes it temporarily. Recognition strengthens the walls, but one serious blow can reveal how much of the structure depends on external confirmation. This explains a common form of self-sabotage. The person begins to destroy opportunities before the opportunities can judge him. He arrives late, neglects preparation, chooses impossible deadlines, creates unnecessary conflict, or abandons the work just before completion. Then, if failure comes, he can blame the conditions instead of the limit of his ability. The sabotage creates an escape route. If I had truly tried, he tells himself, the result would have been different. Notice the cunning of this defense. It preserves the fantasy at the cost of the future. The ego would rather lose the battle under suspicious circumstances than fight cleanly and discover its actual strength. This pattern can continue for decades because each damaged opportunity produces a convenient alibi. The person can always point to bad timing, incompetent partners, unfair institutions, family obligations, or a world that failed to recognize him. Some of these obstacles may be real, but when the same tragedy repeats under different names, stop studying the circumstances and study the pattern. Do not underestimate how powerful this mechanism can become. A person may sacrifice years, relationships, money, and reputation to avoid one unbearable conclusion: that he is talented but not invulnerable. Yet invulnerability was never required. Mastery demands the opposite. It requires repeated contact with weakness. The serious craftsman wants to know where the blade is dull. The experienced commander wants bad news before battle, not after it. Only the insecure ruler punishes the messenger. Treat criticism the same way. Do not ask whether it injures your pride. Ask whether it contains information you can use. A criticism can be malicious and still reveal a weakness. A rival can hate you and still expose your blind spot. Your task is not to love the messenger. Your task is to extract intelligence from the message. This is where gifted people must become colder toward themselves. Separate identity from performance. A bad result does not erase ability. An ability does not excuse a bad result. Both can exist at once. Once you understand this, criticism loses some of its poison. You no longer need to defend a sacred image. You can revise, discard, rebuild, and return stronger. But many never make this separation. Instead, they build elaborate explanations around every wound. They turn sensitivity into sophistication, defensiveness into standards, withdrawal into independence. The language becomes intelligent, while the behavior remains governed by fear. And once fear learns to speak in the language of intelligence, it becomes much harder to detect. That is the next danger. The gifted mind does not merely hide from judgment. It can construct an entire philosophy explaining why avoidance is wisdom. And this is where intelligence itself becomes the weapon of self-destruction. Once fear learns to speak in the language of intelligence, it becomes almost impossible to recognize because it no longer sounds like fear. It sounds like prudence, standards, research, patience, timing, and careful judgment. This is the art of intellectual avoidance. The gifted mind rarely says, I am afraid to begin. It says, I need more information. It rarely says, I am afraid to be judged. It says, the conditions are not yet favorable. It rarely says, I do not want reality to test me. It says, the strategy still needs refinement. The words are intelligent. The logic is polished. And the conclusion is always the same. Not yet. This is why intelligence can become such an efficient servant of cowardice. A simple mind may invent a simple excuse, but a sophisticated mind can build an entire fortress around hesitation. It can collect evidence, quote experts, forecast risks, construct models, compare scenarios, and still avoid the one act that would produce real information, at some point, preparation stops reducing uncertainty and begins protecting identity. You must learn to recognize that point. If 6 months of research have not moved you closer to a decision, the problem may no longer be ignorance. The problem may be that knowledge has become anesthesia. It keeps the mind occupied while protecting the ego from exposure. There is a particular pleasure in preparation, because preparation allows you to feel serious without becoming vulnerable. You can organize documents, redesign plans, read another book, attend another course, improve another system. Each action creates the sensation of motion, yet none of them places your reputation, judgment, or ability before the court of reality. This is the hidden bargain. You exchange progress for psychological safety. The danger grows with age because the intelligent person becomes increasingly skilled at defending the bargain. By 40 or 50, he may possess decades of language for explaining why the moment was never right. The economy changed. The partner was unreliable. The market was immature. The family needed him. The idea required more capital. The standards were too low. The standards were too high. Any one explanation may be legitimate. But when every road ends at the same destination, inaction, stop examining the roads. Examine the traveler. The old courts were filled with advisors who could explain why an army should not move, why a treaty should not be signed, why a rival should not be confronted. Sometimes caution saved kingdoms. Sometimes it merely gave fear the dignity of policy. Your mind has its own court, and every argument inside it is not equally loyal to your future. Some arguments exist only to protect your present comfort. Never confuse complexity with truth. The most important decisions in life often become clear long before they become comfortable. The call that must be made, the work that must be released, the conversation that must occur, the risk that must finally be taken. What remains is not analysis. What remains is the price. The gifted avoid this price by pretending the decision is still intellectual when it has already become emotional. They keep thinking because thinking is cheaper than exposure, but there is a severe cost to this habit. Every time you use intelligence to escape action, you train intelligence to serve fear. The instrument that should sharpen your choices becomes the lawyer defending your paralysis. Over time, the arguments become so convincing that you no longer experience yourself as afraid. You experience yourself as discerning. This is the most dangerous stage because the prison now feels like wisdom. Break the pattern by forcing thought to produce a decision. Give research an ending. Give preparation a deadline. Decide what evidence would actually change your course. And when that evidence is sufficient, move. Do not ask for certainty. Certainty is often the final luxury demanded by a frightened ego. Ask instead whether you know enough to take the next irreversible step, then take it. Intelligence earns its value when it improves execution, not when it replaces execution. But even action does not end the problem. A gifted person can stop hiding in analysis and begin hiding somewhere more public, inside a carefully constructed image of who he is becoming. Once the mind discovers that admiration can be gained before achievement, another prison appears. The public mask begins as a convenience, then becomes a hunger, and finally becomes a master. Once a gifted person discovers that admiration can be earned